Did a front end clunk in your B9 Audi A4 turn into a 4-digit estimate? Well, I'm Rusty with FCP Aero, and I'm here to show you how to replace the front control arms and save you thousands by doing it yourself. In front of me on the table, we have a complete kit from Lem 4-Door that we've compiled. You can purchase these control arms all individually. All the control arm hardware, inner and outer of these upper and lower control arms are going to be one-time use. We'll be going over all the replacement on the passenger side while it is a mirror on the driver's side. The uppers are going to be a little bit tricky if we have an issue with the upper pinch bolt, but hopefully we'll be all right. This kit does include 4 pinch bolts while the vehicle only has 2 in the vehicle. If you were to purchase these control arms individually, the upper control arms would come with a pinch bolt for each one, which is why the kit actually does come with 4. 2 are going to be needed for this kit, and having an extra one is definitely handy. If you've ever had to struggle to get that bolt out, it may even be helpful to have an extra one to hammer the old one out. But some things to look for if you have the concern of needing ball joints, control arm bushings, or anything like that. The uppers tend to wear out on the bushing end, closer to the strut, closer to the body, while the lowers can actually leak some fluid from the front or rear bushings. While the bushings do fail prior to the ball joints, it is good practice to replace the control arm with new ball joints. You can certainly go ahead and press out the bushings. However, that is quite tedious work, and I'm sure by the time the bushings are reinstalled, the ball joints are not far behind. Generally around 50 to 60,000 miles, you can see some wear starting on those inner control arms as we were just discussing, but the ball joints tend to last a little bit longer, which is why we do suggest to do them all together at once. And if you have one worn out bushing, chances are the rest of them aren't far behind, which is why we've compiled this complete kit to rebuild the entire front end. The only thing we're not going to be replacing are the tie rod ends in this DIY, but follow along and we'll go over every step of the way. Now that we've gone over everything on the table, let's talk about some tools we're going to need to take care of the job. Now, as far as tools are concerned in this DIY for the front control arms, I've got pretty much everything I think I'm going to need, but let's go through it. 1/2-inch impact is definitely going to be helpful for getting a lot of these tighter bolts out. I've got a couple of different hammers, a steel hammer as well as a dead blow. I've got a decently sized pry bar, a 3/8 ratchet with quite a bit of length on it, a 3/8 torque wrench, as well as a 1/2-inch torque wrench. We've got a 3/8 breaker bar. You'll see why that's going to be handy later. I've got a 1/4-inch ratchet, a small panel tool, a punch, a pair of wheel hangers, a strut spreader, a T25, a T30, a 1/4-inch extension, 10mm wrench, a 16mm wrench, an 18mm wrench, and then we have these 2 double box end 18 and 16 wrenches. We've also got a torque marker for making sure we can do that 90 degree with some hand tools. This is not necessary, but accompanying the T30 and T25, we have a small screw gun, a pretty high powered flashlight. Off to the side here, I do have an impact air hammer, as well as a couple of bits. Depending on how stubborn these control arms are in the steering knuckles, we may need that as well. In the front, we've got a bunch of sockets. I've got a M12 or 12mm triple square, a T40 Torx bit, a 10mm socket. I did put 2 16mm here, as a couple of these bolts are 12 point, so we have a 12-point 16mm as well as a 6-point 16mm. 17mm for removing the wheels, an 18mm and a 21mm. And keep in mind throughout here, I may be using different drives and different lengths of all these sockets. Up front here, we do have a tape measure that we're going to be needing to check the ride height. Also, optionally, is a 19mm socket, which may make it a little bit easier to get a ride height measurement. Now that I've gone over everything on the table, there's one more thing I do want to bring into the picture. A lot of these bolts are going to be fairly tight to loosen as well as tighten, so doing some of the final torques, you may want a little bit of assistance. I've got an extra jack handle here that I'll probably put on the end of one of these box wrenches. But with that, let's go ahead and get into the repair. So before we get started, we do want to take a ride height measurement. With all these control arms being replaced, we have a lot of bushings that are going to need to be torqued at ride height. So I've already got the center cap removed. You can certainly do it with the center cap installed by just measuring from the center of the outer rings to the top of the fender. I like to use a 19mm socket. It gives me a little bit better with having that outside of the wheel here, as that does kind of start to bend in from here. So from the fender's edge to the center, we've got about 370 to 375 millimeters. So we're going to want to replicate that once we get all the new control arms in, leaving everything loose and compressing the suspension either up on the lift or back on the ground. If you recall, we've already done this on our B9 Audi S5, in which we torqued everything on wood blocks back on the ground. which hopefully we don't have to do that again. That had a little bit stiffer suspension, so maybe on this baseline A4 we will be able to compress the suspension on the lift. But let's get this thing apart and get started. Taking off the front wheel, we do have the lug cap puller from the trunk. If you don't have one, it's definitely handy to have. It's not going to scratch the wheel. It's going to easily remove these lug caps. You can certainly get them off with a pair of pliers, but this is definitely the best course of action. Once we get those off, we'll use a 17mm to remove the wheel. Use a couple of M14 by 1.5 wheel hangers, make my life a little easier. So we're going to be starting on the upper control arms. The pinch bolt, as I discussed earlier, does have a history of becoming seized. It's a steel bolt in an aluminum upright. Not really advised to use heat because you can distort the aluminum. But the thing that most people do forget is make sure you support the hub of the vehicle, pushing it up, because as you release this bolt, what happens is these will rise a little bit and it basically lock that bolt into place. So before you release the upper control arm pinch bolt, be sure to support the hub either with a floor jack. We're going to be using a pole jack in this situation here. But again, just taking a lot of the weight off of this to ensure that this does not get itself stuck. It may actually seize even if you take the weight off of it, but it'll make for a little bit easier removal and installation if you're supporting the weight of the knuckle. So we're going to raise this up just a little bit and loosen up that upper pinch bolt. So supporting the knuckle either from the lower control arm or the lower ball joint, definitely not advised on the rotor, as the only thing holding that rotor in is that little T30 there. So just bring it up basically to ride height. You'll notice the vehicle will start to resist a little bit and it may start to come off of the lift or the jack stand. So be cautious there. Before we crack that loose, it certainly can't hurt to add a little bit of penetrating oil to make the removal a little bit easier. And on these, you can get kind of into the knuckle here in these openings. With two 16mm wrenches, we're going to crack the outside loose. Luckily, this one feels like it's already starting to loosen up. And before you take that nut all the way off, I've just run it all the way down to the end of the bolt and give it a couple taps. And again, I realize not everyone's going to be this fortunate. You may have to use an air hammer. You may have to sit there and really loosen this up. As these vehicles begin to wear, they are certainly going to be a little bit more difficult to take apart. I've had a couple of the old B5s back in my day and spent some time taking this one apart. All right, so I was just kind of spinning it out to get it past there. You can see we've already got some corrosion starting here. Wouldn't have been too much longer before this one really did get stuck in there. Again, we did get lucky at this point. Now with a punch and a hammer, we're going to push the ball joints up through the steering knuckle here. You don't want to open up any of these gaps here. Generally, they're not going to come back. You could even crack the ear off of the steering knuckle, and this component is very, very expensive. So now that we've got that upper pinch bolt loose and removed, I'm going to just crack these inner control arm bolts with a 16mm. Just crack these loose. Loosen these up, giving you a little bit less tension on these upper arms. Well, we don't have all day. I got a little impatient trying to use a hammer and a punch, so I've resorted to a little bit more malicious removal. But now, obviously, if you don't have an air compressor or an air hammer, you might be sitting there for a little while. Do not open these up. They're a very firm fit, and you can certainly break those off, as I said earlier. But now we've got both of these out, kind of. There we go. Brought the vehicle back down so that we can get a little bit better view for you guys, but now that we've already loosened these up, it should be quite easy to remove. May even be able to get them out by hand. Keep in mind the front arm and rear arm are different in the uppers. They look somewhat similar, but they are a little bit different, and there is a little bit of a difference in the angle, so don't mix them up. You can see here, ever so slightly, the rear one does have a slightly different bend to it, and they are labeled and a left for the driver's side, but we'll get the other one out here. And like that, the uppers are out. I would like to make mention too that the uppers on the passenger side have a slightly different thread on the very end. It's a little bit to do with what's going on in the engine bay, but the passenger side has these slightly different ones driver's side is going to have the same thread all the way out. So don't be alarmed if you pull these out and they look kind of weird. They do look weird. You're not wrong. Now we're ready to go ahead and put the new arms in. As I mentioned, if you were to oppose these, they would normally go in this way. And if you were to switch them, I imagine that would give for some very interesting steering characteristics and probably change your camber, caster, and things like that. So again, pay attention. There is an R stamped on these, and make sure that you put them in the same orientation that you were removing them. So it wouldn't even be a bad idea to do these one at a time. We're gonna start with the rear one, which does have a little bit more of a curve. Place it into this section of the body, your new bolt, thread it in there. Definitely wanna get these started by hand. Going into the body, run the risk of stripping or doing things like that. So really make sure that we get these started by hand. With any electric guns, leave that still loose and we'll pop that into the upper portion of the steering knuckle in a second. But next up is the front one. Same scenario, new bolt. All right, and with them bolts still pretty loose, flexing the end of the ball joint is definitely gonna help you get these lined up. Just manipulating those a little bit. They definitely come in the package a little bit stiff. Once they're close, we'll put the car back up in the air, supporting the bottom end of this, rising that knuckle back up. Taking a little bit of weight off of this because they're probably a little bit of an angle and it's a very precise fit. So you may have to play around with the knuckle, raising it up and lowering it down, tapping on the top of these to kind of get them to fit in the perfect scenario. So I'm gonna put the car back up a little bit more and we'll get this situated. And now that we're supporting the lower section of this again, kind of play with them as you raise them up. All right, I got the rear one in. Just gonna use the old bolt to hold that in place, because as we're tapping on this one, you could very well force this one back out just by shocking on it. And when the hammer doesn't really work, grab a big pry bar. Once you've got both of those seated, if you recall, the bolt did come in from the back. That fed all the way through. And if it doesn't want to continue right there, we may have to pull down on this a little bit more. Run this bolt through. It's getting a little bit bound up in here. Once you get the threads through, you know we're not going to drag on the control arm, so we're probably all right. Hammer it on in. Looks like there's a little bit of gunk from the inside of there. Definitely could have benefited from a wire brush or something of that sort to clean out some of that upper control arm area, but we'll get that new nut fitted. And we're just going to leave this hand tight for now. Once we got that upper pinch bolt situated, we've got the new nut on there. I'm just going to run this down. And then we're going to go back and torque that to 40 Newton meters. Right. I remember that I torqued it, and we can see in the future. Put a little torque seal on there, and we'll come back to those upper control arm bolts once we get the lowers installed, and we'll torque everything up in one shot. For now, let's get this pull jack out from under here, and we'll catch you guys underneath the car to do the lower control arms. Now, in typical Audi fashion, just to work on the control arms, we will have to remove a bunch of plastic trim panels. The belly pan up here is going to get in the way of getting access to that front control arm, and then the rear control arm bolt is also going to be obstructed by this rear section. So belly pans do have a series of T25s, T30s. There should be like a 13 or a 10 millimeter here. Looks like a previous technician may have flat rated this and decided not to put that one back in. But if you have a complete car in your end, you should have some 13 millimeter bolts here, T25s, T30s, some panel clips back here. Audi did not do us any favors by putting so many different pieces of hardware here. On the sides of this belly pan, there are some T30 plastic rivets that are very prone to stripping out, so be careful when removing these. You may even have to get underneath it with a screwdriver to kind of work it out a little bit. Once you've separated that, kind of put some pressure behind the head of that plastic screw. And we should be good to take that out. That is a silly clip. And we'll do the same thing on the driver's side here. All right, now that we've got those loosened up, we've got some T25s. It should come out just fine. And now that we've got that one out of there, we've got some T25s holding this rear panel on, as well as some large plastic rivets. Once you get those rivets started, we can use something like this to expand them entirely. And then back to the T25. All right, now that we can finally see all of the hardware, you'll notice back here, these aluminum pieces of sheet metal are going to obstruct this bolt coming through the lower rear control arm. So we will have to loosen these up as well on either side. There are a series of 10mm nuts holding them onto the subframe. This one's a little bit tricky. If the exhaust is hot, you're going to want to be careful in that back section there. And there's another 10mm nut going upwards from the bottom area into the frame rail. So we'll get those loosened up and might even just leave it in there and just kind of move it around just to get that bolt out. But we'll get that prepped up and ready to go. All right, with a 10mm wrench, it's probably the easiest course of action here. Crack these loose. And there's a little too much corrosion to get those off by hand. All right, get that one off. And then that one in the rear, like I said, it's kind of close to the exhaust. Once those two are removed, we do still have to gain access to the one on the frame rail over here. Now back on the outside of the frame rail here, with a 10mm 1/4 inch wrench and a about 5/6 inch extension. Just enough room to get that one out. And as I mentioned, you're only going to be able to kind of lift these off the studs slightly. Oh, I did forget one more fastener. Don't be like me, take off all the bolts. There is one more located at the front control arm area. There's a 10mm holding this one in. Now it should be loose. Once all the fasteners, nuts, and bolts are removed, you do have just enough room to kind of wiggle it off the subframe here. You may have to flex it just a tiny bit. There we go. And again, we don't have to take it all the way out. We just need enough room to get this bolt out and as well as gain access to the front lower control arm bolt. So don't forget to put that back in place. But now we can move on to the sway bar end link, the lower strut fork, the lower ball joint, and both of these lower control arms. Let's go ahead. Now that we've made plenty of room for the inner control arm fasteners to come in and out, we'll go back to working on the sway bar end link and the lower shock fork. We're going to be removing this lower front section first with two 16mm. Try this again. And you're going to want a 12 point, so the end of a box end wrench to hold the bolt. Now we'll be able to get the nut removed here, but we will not be able to get the bolt removed until we loosen that lower shock fork. So remember that for reinstallation, you will not be able to put this bolt back in unless that lower shock fork is loose. Moving on to the upper one, same thing. You don't want to hold it with a double box end wrench, or a box end wrench rather. Once we get these removed, we'll be able to probably get the top one out once we get that one loosened up as well. And that we're going to be using two 18mm wrenches. Use a pry bar and remove the bolt. That should come out fairly easy. I did just have this out doing the front struts. Once the lower shock fork is loosened up, you have just enough room to remove this bolt, in theory. There we go. And once that's out, you can kind of manipulate it a little bit to get the upper one out as well. And pay attention to these sway bar links, as there is a smaller section and a larger section. The larger section is going to be going to the component you are bolting it to, whether it is the top section or the lower section, and the smaller one is going to be going to the bolt. So pay attention to that on reinstallation. But now we can continue to work on this lower control arm, removing that triple square and another 18 in the back. As you can see here, the steering rack boot is a little bit in our way. So what we're going to do is turn the wheel all the way to the right, and that'll give us a little bit more manipulation on this accordion here while it is kind of pushed up out of the way, stretched out, just enough room to pull out the bolt here. And I might even suggest to put a little bit of silicone lube here so when you're pulling this out, it doesn't rip that boot. But we'll get this loosened up and then we'll turn the wheel and start working that bolt out. Now with a 12mm triple square, and I've got it on a breaker bar just to give us a little bit more clearance. A normal ratchet head may be a little bit too large to fit in there. and an 18 on the other side. As you can see, it just released the tension on that inner bushing, which was pretty much suspending it up, which is a perfect representation of why we need to torque all these fasteners at ride height. As soon as I loosen that, the bushing let go, dropping the control arm down and kind of getting into a full droop position. If you were to tighten this hardware at this point, you could obviously prematurely wear all the bushings, as the suspension is going to be sitting much higher. Once we've got this bolt loosened up, and turn the steering wheel using a punch and hammer from the backside. This is about the point where that bolt starts to interrupt with this boot, so be very careful, don't rip that boot. May even be easier from the front here. And once you get that clear, make sure that boot isn't damaged. If so, we sell those at fcphero.com, but do the best to get that bolt removed while making sure that wheel is as far possible to either side at which you're working on the right. Turn the wheel to the right, working on the left, turn the wheel to the left. And once that's removed, it should fall right out. May need to use a pry bar to kind of guide it out of this bushing here. There we go. Now with a 16 millimeter, I'm gonna loosen this lower ball joint fastener here. And once that's removed, we are almost clear of this lower control arm. We're gonna grab a spindle spreader and insert that into the lower ball joint, opening this up just enough in order to release this ball joint and taking the control arm and the ball joint out in one shot. We will be assembling this over at the vise with the ball joint seated in the control arm already. So we'll get this situated and then we'll move on to the lower rear control arm. So for these, you're just gonna install it kind of at an angle. Turn it 90 degrees and it'll kind of hit a rest position. At that point, simply remove the control arm and the ball joint all in one shot. We'll leave that there for when we get ready to install the new one. But for now, we'll continue to work on this rear control arm. This is going to be a 21 millimeter here, and then we have two 18s at the rear. Spin the nut back on a couple turns. We're not going to be reusing this one. Let's see if we can whack this with a hammer. You really don't want to whack the aluminum knuckle. There's a steel insert in here as well. So we'll see if we can get this removed without. Although we did not need it, we do offer plenty of ball joint removal alternatives to the Volkswagen Audi tools. So after we've got that released, we're going to move on to the 18 millimeters in here, and we're pretty much almost there. Just got to reassemble everything. Once you remove the nut, the bolt will come out, as we mentioned before, kind of in the area of the heat shield. And the pry bar should come out fairly easily. There we go. With the old lower control arms removed, we're gonna go ahead and grab our new arms. Keep in mind, there are right side and left side, just like when we did the uppers. The lower rear section will have an R for right. So passenger side is gonna be right, driver side is gonna be left. Make sure you put the correct arm in the correct spot. Got the ball joint little cap removed. We've got a new nut for the ball joint. Put that in the knuckle here. Just get the nut started. And we've also got a new control arm bushing bolt here, but we will have to push the steering knuckle out slightly. Once that's lined up, put our bolt in. Just like removal with two 18s. The 21 on the outside here. We're going to use an impact gun to just snug this up, and we'll go back and torque it to the 140 Newton meter spec, I believe. Pulling down on it will seat the ball joint in the aluminum knuckle. And if you're having any difficulty tightening that up, the center of that ball joint utilizes a T40, so you can counter hold that while using a 21 millimeter wrench to snug those up closer. And then once the ball joint stops spinning, we can go back and torque it with a 21 millimeter socket. But I'm gonna get the other ball joint and control arm situated here as well, and we'll come back and fit everything in together. Now that we're over at the bench vise, we do have the right side, passenger side, lower front control arm mounted in the vise. Keep in mind, they do look very similar. There is a slight bend at the very end where the passenger side kind of goes towards the front, and obviously the driver side will as well, but on the opposing side. If If you look at the top, it does have a little bit more meat on one side or the other. So just make sure you're working on the correct control arm. Do these one at a time and make sure that you don't put the wrong control arm in the wrong position. With that out of the way, we've got our new ball joint nut. All right. If you do have to counterhold that, there is a provision for what looks like about a 7mm Allen in there, but we were able to hand tighten that up, and then we're gonna go back and tighten this upper ball joint nut to 140 Newton meters. You could certainly do this in the car with the ball joint seated in the knuckle. However, with the axle installed, you would have to release the axle bolt, get it out of the way, in order to be able to tighten this up. So doing this on the ground, either with your foot on the side or a buddy holding it, or in a bench vise, is definitely going to be the best course of action for reinstalling this. So torque wrench is set to 140 Newton meters on a 21mm fastener. 120, 30, 140. All right. Obviously perform the same action on the driver's side arm, but we'll catch you guys back over at the car to get this thing ready to be reinstalled. Now that we're back from the bench, we've got our new control arm with the new ball joint. It may be a little bit helpful to insert that in here and kind of articulate that ball joint a little bit before fully installing it in the correct position. Dropping it into the arm, making sure that it moves around quite a bit. We'll have to push the knuckle out just enough while not extending the axle fully. And kind of wiggle this up into place. And if you remember the front control arm, we did have to manipulate the accordion boot on the inner tie rod quite a bit, but we don't want to lose this control arm when we go to turn the wheel. So I'm going to actually stick a bolt in the back here. Anything will do. I'm just going to push that bolt out when I go to push the new one in anyway. So go back and turn the wheel all the way to the right. Generally, I don't recommend hammering a bolt into a section like this, but simply they give you just enough clearance to get that bolt in. Go ahead and throw the 18mm nut on the back there. I'm going to use the pull jack to raise this knuckle until that ball joint drops into place. Once you've got the ball joint fully seated, we can remove the strut spreader and then put the new bolt for the ball joint in that place. And once we've got that installed, we're going to torque that to 40 Newton meters. And we can probably go ahead and throw the through bolt in for the strut. And if you recall doing the strut fork, we also had a bit of an issue with the sway bar link hardware. So before we install the strut fork, let's get the sway bar link hardware set up, and then we'll bring the strut fork back into position and put that through bolt down below. So pushing the strut fork back out of the way, lower bolt is going to be the shorter. It may actually be easier to put it in the sway bar link, get it in position, throw the nut on here. Longer bolt is going to go through the top of the strut fork. You may have to push it up or down on the sway bar or manipulate the knuckle around a little bit. This is another bushing point, so we don't want to tighten these all the way. We're just going to snug these close so that they do still spin, and we'll tighten these all together with inner control arm bushings. Once that's fitted there, that's another bushing, so another point that we're going to want to get to later on. And we've got one more control arm to go. Now on the rear control arm, I'm going to fit this right like that. That should go fit the nut on the outer ball joint. Snug it up with an impact gun and a 21. With the knuckle supported like this still, keeping it up a little bit higher is going to help line this up. All right. Once you got the bushing situated in there, it may take several times to kind of work it back and forth with pry bar, hammer, what have you, but you don't want to really stress that bolt. You could do some damage to that nice new bolt. Once we've got it poking through on the other side. All right, tight. I'm going to back it back off so the bushing can kind of relax in place, and you kind of want all the fasteners to be in almost tight, but still somewhat loose. Now that we've got the passenger side all installed, before we go and torque everything up, I'm going to take a second and replace all the control arms on the driver's side. Keep in mind, it is the exact same operation that we just showed you on the passenger side, but we do want to torque everything at ride height because the sway bar is connected side to side. We're going to make sure that everything is snugged up at the same time. So I'll catch you guys back once I get this one done, and we will finalize torquing all the control arms. So once you've got all 8 control arms replaced on driver's and passenger side, we're going to be showing you on the passenger side how to get the vehicle back to ride height. We did take that measurement earlier at about 375 millimeters, and from fender to center, we're currently at about 500. So I wouldn't recommend doing the same scenario with your on jack stands, because as you compress one corner, the vehicle may get unstable. So I would recommend getting at least 2 or 3 of the tires back on the ground and trying to compress the suspension either with a floor jack or something like that. We're on a 2-post lift, so I'm going to use this pull jack. I've got it compressed underneath the control arm with a little 2x4. I'm just going to raise this up, keeping an eye on the lift and trying to get the center of the axle closer to that fender before going back and torquing everything down. Yep, so unfortunately, just like the S5 we did this on, it's not going to allow us to compress the suspension on a lift, so we're going to have to get the wheels back on and get the vehicle back down on all fours and torque everything with the car on the ground. Might even try to do this with one wheel off, the lift out from underneath it, similar to how you'd be doing it in the driveway with a floor jack underneath. That way we're at least able to get to everything. Doing it on the ground on the blocks of wood wasn't really easy. So yeah, let's throw the wheel back on and see if we can get this thing on the ground. Well, we weren't able to compress the suspension. We're back on the ground, got the car on all fours on some ramps, and I've got the torque wrench on the front control arm here. We're gonna set this to 50 Newton meters, and then there's a 90-degree afterwards. We're gonna try to do the 50 Newton meters because trying to do the 90 inside this tight quarter with the wheel on is not gonna be possible. But just like we did on the B9 S5, I torqued everything on the ground to the initial first torque and then gave it the final 90-degree once we had the vehicle up in the air. What that's going to do is it's going to hold the bushing in place like so. So 50 Newton meters on that 16 millimeter front control arm. And now I'm going to try to get to the rear upper control arm here. Now back on the lower control arms, I've got an 18 holding the front of the bolt, and I'm going to torque the nut on the back with another 18. We'll do the initial 90 Newton meters, and then once we get the car back up in the air, we'll finish it off with the 90-degree turn and compress the suspension there, but hopefully this will hold the bushing in place. Yep, that should definitely hold it in place. All right, now that we've got that one and the uppers taken care of, we still have to do the inner bushing as well as the rear. This one we're going to be holding with a triple square and an 18 as well. That one's going to be 70 Newton meters, and then we're going to have to do 180 degrees. Obviously, down here, I'm definitely not going to have the grip strength or ability to swing this thing 180 degrees, so we'll also do that one when we're up in the air. All right, so as you can see, we had to turn the wheel all the way to extend this boot, similar to how when we removed the bolt, but now that we've got that all the way out, the accordions allow for the torque wrench to fit in there with the short triple square counter holding with an 18. Let's see if I can do this lefty. All right, there's 70 at least. So again, we're going to do the full 180 once we get the car up in the air, because there's no way I'm going to be able to do a 180-degree turn on that M14 or M12 bolt, large suspension bolt, on my back. And I don't think anyone else will be able to either. But let me know in the comments if you were able to. Again, counter holding with an 18 wrench and an 18 socket. We're torquing this to 70 Newton meters to start. We'll go back and do the 180 later. Try to get that out without hitting myself in the face. And now we still have to do the sway bar end links, and I would suggest doing both of those at the same time as well. If you've done all of your control arms on the passenger side, now move over to the driver's side while you still have the tools available. But we'll catch you for the sway bar links with 2 16s here in a second. Now that we've got all the control arms at least started to be torqued, we're going to move on to the sway bar links. So we've got the 12-point box end of my wrench on the head of the bolt. It's a 16 millimeter. And then I've got a 16 millimeter socket on the torque wrench. And we're torquing these to 40 Newton meters. And we have to go back and do a 90-degree turn. Not much room in here. All right, that's the lower. Let's go to the upper. I'm gonna have to swap to a 12-point socket. All right. Sway bar links are tight. Control arms are tight. Lower strut fork is tight. So essentially this should hold everything in position so that when we lift it all up, get the wheel back off, we can do the final angle. We need to do a 90 on these. We need to do a 90 on the sway bar end links, and we need to do 180 on the inner control arm to subframe. But while you're down here, go ahead and do the exact same thing on the driver's side, sway bar links, control arm bushings, and all that. And then once we get the car up in the air, we can finalize everything all in one shot. So we'll catch you guys back up in the air. It's gonna be a little more comfortable. Essentially, we've already pinched it and done the initial 50, 70, 40 Newton meters, whatever it may be. And hopefully that'll retain the bushing position so that when we go back and do the 90, it is in the same spot. Not really proven, but we're gonna try it anyway. So what I'm gonna do is mark everything as it is, because some of these bolts you do have to counter hold. So in doing so, you do run the risk of rotating that bolt. So if you're just marking the nut on the fastener and you rotate the entire bolt, your angle is not exactly as accurate as it's going to be, but this isn't exactly an accurate measurement anyway. I'm using my calibrated eyeball and a marker to do our angles here. So the strut fork is gonna be a 90-degree. So I'll do a mark kind of at the 3 o'clock position so I can see it from the side. And then we're gonna wanna do another mark down here. I'm not gonna be rotating the bolt, I'll rotate the nut, but I just wanna make sure this stays in the same position. The front control arm here is gonna be 180 degrees. Put another mark right here, just to kind of give us an indication so that we know it didn't move. If it does move, you're gonna wanna start over. On the back side, I'll do the same thing. These have a washer, so pay attention to that and make sure you mark the actual component. So again, I'm just gonna make a mark on the 9 o'clock position. I'm gonna rotate it up to 12. And we're gonna do that on all the fasteners. Obviously, if you have the fancy Volkswagen Audi torque wrench or a digital angle torque wrench, this is more than doable, but some of these don't allow for the torque wrench to fit in there. So we gotta get a little creative here. These lower ones, I'm gonna make a mark at the 6 o'clock position as well as the 12 o'clock position. Oh, that's like nails on a chalkboard. And then we're gonna have to completely 180 degree that one as well as this one. But this bolt head here, I'm just gonna put an indicator there. Moving back to the upper control arms, we'll do the same thing here. So starting up top, we'll have a 16 millimeter and I'm gonna turn that 90 degrees. Obviously, if you have a torque wrench, set that up, but finding it a little bit easier in these tight spaces to use this double box wrench. That's about 90. Moving on to the rear, same thing, 16 millimeter, 90 degrees. That's 90 degrees as well, so we're good up top. With the 16 millimeter still, we'll come back to the sway bar end links and we'll get those situated. 90 there, double check your marks, make sure the bolt didn't move. So sway bar end links and upper control arms are all set. We're done with the 16s. Go ahead and grab yourself 2 18s. That's 180 out. So we'll move on to the rear one. All right, this one we've got in a 90-degree interval, kind of. I wasn't really able to get the pen back in there. Looks like 90, so I'm gonna make another mark now. All right, looks like we've done the final torque angle on everything. We do still have that loose heat shield. We've got some belly pans to put on, but I'm gonna go ahead and take a second to wipe off all of my marks because I kind of finger painted all over the hardware, but I'm gonna go and clean up all the angle marks, do a final torque mark on everything, and we'll catch you back in a second, throw the belly pan on and put the wheels back on. All right, back underneath the car before we put the belly pan on, we did have these heat shields loose and we didn't take them out because you actually have to remove the subframe to do so. So go ahead and put them back on the studs on both sides. We've already got the driver's side mounted. And there, we got another one on the outside. And there's another one on the frame rail. So just kind of flex it back into position. Got one nut on the front of the subframe right here. And then we can go ahead and tighten these all up. The torque spec on these is about 8 Newton meters. I'm just gonna kind of snug them all up. It's not really holding anything too crucial. These heat shields just don't want to be rattling. Now that that's taken care of, we'll grab the rear section of the belly pan. If you recall, the front section came off first and the rear section came off last. So installation is the reverse of removal. All right, with the rear belly pan, I've got a couple of the plastic rivets for the rear, and I've got one screw to hold it in place. So I'll kind of put it up into place and put one of the plastic rivets in the rear transmission mount. The other one over here. Depress the center of that one. Same thing over here. And then that'll make sure that everything should line up. And we'll put one more screw in the middle to keep this in place while we grab the rest. Now we'll grab the rest of the large T25s with washers and a T25 bit, and we'll get ready to reinstall these as well. Once we have that rear section installed, the hard plastic belly pan is next up. I'm going to tuck it under the front of the bumper just slightly. And there should be one provision where it attaches to the rear belly pan with the T25 screw there. Put one more in the front when we go get the rest of the hardware. And keep in mind when we took this one down, as I said earlier, somebody forgot the M8 bolts on the side, so you may have those as well. I'll go back and put all the T25s in throughout. Now swapping over to a T30 bit, we've got 4 coarse T30s in the front that go into the radiator support. And then last but not least, we have 2 of the additional plastic clips that went in on the side. I can install those. And once you have the belly pan reinstalled, we're going to get the car back on the ground and get the wheels on, torque them up, and we'll catch you down there in a second. Now back on the ground, we're going to torque the wheel with a 17mm socket and a 1/2-inch torque wrench to 120 Newton meters. All right, that pretty much takes care of the front control arms on the B9 Audi A4. Hope you guys enjoyed today's video. One thing I do want to mention before we close this out is with any suspension repairs, you will want to get a 4-wheel alignment to ensure your tires wear correctly and the vehicle doesn't have any pulling or dancing going down the road. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, drop them down in the comments section below. Otherwise, don't forget to subscribe because we'll have plenty more videos on this vehicle and many others like it. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll catch you on the next one.